I am Joyce Marzan from the Department of Speech Pathology at the University of the Philippines, Manila. As you can see, I'm not a linguist, but my area of interest is language development in Filipino children, mostly for purposes of being able to develop normative data and assessment protocols that can help us to identify those children with oral language disorders, to problem solve what their deficit skills are, sub-skills are, and to aid in appropriate goal setting and intervention. I will be presenting a study, a longitudinal study, small sample study, showing the spontaneous language development of 5 to 6 Filipino children from the age of approximately 1 to 3.5 or 4.
The data collected from these language samples was analyzed descriptively in very broad strokes. It is my hope that researchers such as Weng Garcia and others will be able to use the data to answer more focused questions. 6 children participated in this study, 5 female and 1 male. All came from middle-income families. Hart and Riesly in 1995 note that compared to children from lower-income families, children below 3 years of age from middle-income families received an amount of stimulation at home that correlated with greater school success up to at least the 3rd grade. All children in our study showed average overall development based on the Early Childhood Care and Development Checklist, which was created and normed for use in the Philippines. Recordings were made every 2 months. Recordings beginning from the video in which the child's first use of at least one word occurs were included in the data. This was at about 1 year, 2 months for 5 of the children. Recording continued until these children were about 3.5 years old. For one child, recordings began when she was 2.5 and continued until she was 5. Hence, data starting at about 3.5 years of age come only from one child. It should be noted that for this child, her first words occurred long before she was 2.5 years old. Videos were recorded as is where is, doing whatever the family was doing at the time of recording. However, recording devices were visible to the children and became part of the conversation. Some editing was done to better facilitate accuracy of transcription, and also for ethical purposes, for example, when consent was withdrawn for a segment of the video recorded sessions. Videos were transcribed and analyzed manually using the Child Language Data Exchange System. A total of 41 man-hours was required to transcribe and analyze each video. This highlights the need for automation of these processes. Inter-rater reliability of 85 to 95% was achieved for both transcription and analysis. This yielded a total of 78 videos containing 39,000 utterances of persons interacting with the child and 15,000 propositional utterances produced by the children themselves. Language input to the child in this data was not child-directed utterances in a dyadic interaction. Family and group interactions are typical of Filipino homes. Hence, any utterance the child responded to or attended to was included in the analysis. Researchers were able to make this judgment call as they viewed the language sample videos while doing the analysis. For half hour of data collection, the children were exposed to a mean of 505 utterances. This means they were receiving language input every 4 seconds. On the average. As the families reported that the video sessions were representative of their daily lives, it is hoped that the children received this level of language stimulation for many hours throughout the day. Language input was short and sweet, remaining between 3 to 4 words per utterance throughout the sample. The children's mean length of utterance was computed in morphemes. The children had an MLU of about 1.5 at 2 years of age, and an MLU of 3.5 at 3.5 years of age. The MLU of the children in this study was compared with other studies, although no statistical comparison was made. The purple line shows the MLU from Brown's landmark study in 1973. We also see the MLU of Dutch-Turkish bilinguals in 2010, Cantonese-English bilinguals in 2006, Spanish-English bilinguals in 2005, English monolinguals in 2006, and the children in this study in 2013. Visual inspection appears to indicate similar trends in MLU development across samples. For purposes of this study, a unique word was defined as a stem together with its affixes. Hence, ball is a different word from balls, and kuha is a different word from kinuha. The number of unique words in a child's lexicon was determined by counting the number of unique words used during the first recording session, then adding to it the number of unique words used in the next session which had not been used in the previous session. This therefore represents the number of unique words produced by each child within the half-hour sessions, and most likely underestimates the actual total lexicon of the child. Elicited imitations were not counted as words used by the child, but we did include unelicited imitations and any recognizable phonological form that the child used with clear attention to the referent. For example, if it was raining outside and a child's aunt said, "Look out the window," and the child responded with "Ido," ulan, meaning rain, while pointing to the window, then "Ido" was counted as window. We see here a growth from about 200 words before the second birthday to about 1,000 words by 3.5 years of age, consistently across all children. Anna had used almost 2,000 different words from the time she was 2.5 until she turned 5. The children's MLU was around 2 at the time that there were about 300 words in their lexicon, and 4.5 when their lexicon reached about 1,750 words. At the very early stages of language development, the child's language consisted primarily in content words, nouns, verbs, modifiers, but we see a gradual increase in the use of function words, ang, nang, prepositions, etc., which appeared to stabilize at around 30 to 40% of all words used per half hour. The children engaged in code switching and code mixing. We see here the 10 most frequently used English nouns, the 10 most frequently used Tagalog nouns, and the 10 most frequently used nouns across both languages. Most frequent here was defined as the number of videos in which the noun was used, rather than the absolute frequency of occurrence of the noun within the corpus. The most frequently occurring noun in the corpus in terms of frequency of use, frequency of occurrence within the corpus, was balloon, and it was used by one child more than 50 times in a single video recorded on his birthday. We see a preference for using Tagalog for some categories and English for others, based on the number of times a substantive was named. Animals, toys, and plants were named 95 to 100% of the time in English by this group. On the other hand, there was a preference for using Tagalog to label places, such as cuarto, room, or taas, up, above, on top, which in Tagalog is a noun, and body parts. It is possible that this is not representative of the general population of Filipino children. The children in this study were from middle-income families. Their parents had all earned at least an undergraduate degree, and university-level education in the Philippines is largely in English. This may have influenced the English fluency of their families. The children code mixed when using verbs. Base syntax, affixes, or word order were a mix of both English and Tagalog. For example, "Can you urong this for me?" Urong meaning move. And "Nagre-read kami," or we are or we're reading. Looking at only the verb, root, or stem, it seems the children used an equal number of verbs in English and Tagalog. 7 of the most frequently occurring verb stems were in Tagalog, while 3 were in English. However, we note that the 50 most frequently occurring verb stems included a translational equivalent for 9 of these top verbs. In terms of type of verb relations used, we see that children used single constituent utterances exclusively until around 18 months of age. At this time, they began coding object relations using some form of argument and predicate in a single utterance. Even when coding object relations appeared to stabilize in their repertoire, they also continued to use single constituent utterances, often ellipses, about half of the time. Event relations, usually coded in complex or multi-verb utterances, were rarely used. Their single constituent utterances predominantly consisted of substantives. In other words, they primarily used nouns, bubbles, and pronouns, yun, to point out the existence of an object or a person, etc. When they began using simple sentences, the main theme of their sentences shifted to actions made by some subject or agent. For example, blow ako, or I blow. Inom ka, you drink. Mommy, draw a circle. They continued to code existence with lesser frequency than action, but still coded it more frequently than other categories. At this time, they coded existence using at least 2 words in a single utterance. More than 800 different verbs were used by all the children combined. Clearly, the greatest variety of verbs was seen for coding action, followed by locative action or movement from one place to another, followed by state, including emotions. Within each semantic category, an effort was made to further group verbs according to general themes. I will pause for a moment to give you the opportunity to review the content of this slide. Embedded categories are here defined as non-verb categories or concepts added to an utterance already containing an argument-predicate relationship. They can be coded in free morphemes such as adjectives or in bound morphemes such as affixes that change the tense or aspect or number of a word. The children started using embedded categories at or just before their 2nd birthday. While they embedded a number of categories, the 2 most frequently coded were temporal and quantity. Temporal notions occurred over 1,500 times in the corpus, such as natapon, fell versus fall, sleeping ako, progressive versus infinitive, mamaya siya makita, I will see her later. Quantity occurred almost 800 times in the corpus. Quantity was coded as plurals, which were counted only when a child also spontaneously and appropriately used the singular form as well, indicating that the child distinguished between one and more than one instance of the referent. For example, tayo, us or we, when the child also used ako, I or me. Sila, they, them, when the child also used siya, he, she. Toys, when the child also used toy. It was also coded in single words such as all, many, konti, meaning few. Until about 2 years of age, the parts of speech most frequently used by the children were nouns and verbs. After that, pronouns were also used with increased frequency. One hypothesis might be that this is because pronouns function as case markers in Filipino. I know that I jumped from constituent analysis to predicate-argument combinations and back. Perhaps our friends in linguistics can help me with this. In terms of predicate-argument combinations, the most frequent utterances were, not surprisingly, vocalizations and exclamations that did not form part of any syntactic utterance. Wow! And then after that, nouns and verbs. When the children did start coding predicate-argument relationships, the most frequently coded were what we call nonverbal predicates, or an utterance with a non-lexical verb, combined with arguments such as, ako ang princess, I am princess. Closely followed by verb-subject combinations, alam ko, I know, and nonverbal predicates and arguments in intransitive constructions such as akin yan, that mine. The children used basic verb forms as well as inflections that created the contemplated imperfective and perfective aspects and the past and progressive tenses. They used a combination of 24 different verb inflections. The proportion of obligatory contexts in which the children used verb inflections developed over time, with no inflections at 1.5 years of age, to use of inflections in about 3/4 of the utterances in Tagalog in which inflections were expected by around 3 years of age. Consistent use of present tense and progressive affixes when required in English appeared to develop sooner. When we look at what the children did when verb inflections were expected, we see that they either omitted them or used them appropriately. Rarely did they make errors or substitutions when they did use verb inflections. The omission of inflections may indicate that despite the number of prefixes, infixes, and suffixes that verb roots were embedded in, children were able to extract that root from the input they received. This raises the question, did those around them use primarily uninflected forms? Based on this comparison, there appeared to be a greater proportion of inflected verbs in the input to the child than in the utterances produced by the children themselves. Again, a statistical comparison would be needed to confirm this. Those interacting with the children used a variety of verb inflections at every age level, although some dominance of the infinitive or basic uninflected form can be seen. In terms of language use, we often desire that children learn to express their wants and needs. What do typically developing Filipino children actually use their language for? Based on this data, they use language to share experiences, to engage in intersubjective subjectivity, about half of the time. These are suggestions that arise from this data to foster language development in both typically and atypically developing children. How can this data be used, and in particular, how can it contribute to the development of early reading materials for Filipino children? In general, perhaps this data can become a tentative basis for a milestone-based language development scale for Filipino children. When working to foster the children's language development, we need to remember to build vocabulary before expecting changes in MLU, to foster their use of pronouns, especially among Filipino children. We need to teach grammatical morphemes, coding aspect, and also help the children to share ideas and experiences rather than simply using language to get what they want and or what they need. With regard to developing early reading materials, I make these suggestions without being an expert in reading myself, but it would seem that it would be important to include actions on objects and experiences, verbs, rather than limiting these early reading materials to isolated pictures of nouns. Also, it would be important to use reading and reading with the child as an opportunity for shared experience and talking about that shared experience. That perhaps the books should contain short sentences, or the person telling the story that the book depicts should use short sentences in that storytelling. And that perhaps the lexicon from this study can be used in those books because there is some evidence that this lexicon is familiar to Filipino preschoolers. Thank you.
This work that you did is really important because it's like the only one in the Philippines that's available. Thank you very much. I was wondering, it would be really interesting to see how the work that Jessica Montag has done with children, like seeing how interactions happen when reading books and all that, whether this will have an impact on language use, on the maximum length of utterance, and so on. Do you have any indicator or any observation during your research that showed that possibility?
Some book reading activities were included in the data collection, so long as it was a natural interaction between the child and whoever was interacting with them. But I didn't separate out the analysis at all. The one thing I can say is that I actually did do data collection among lower income families as well, but there are issues with its how do you say, there are consent issues at the moment which prevent me from analyzing the data. But one of the things I did in order to give back to the community, since they were helping me with my research, is to bring books, which when it was not part of my research, was to bring books and to read a little bit to the children that were participating in the study. And really, I would start with 2 or 3 kids in one home, and by the time I got halfway through one picture book, I would have the whole neighborhood looking in the window or coming into the room. So I think there could be impact because kids from lower income families who do have access to cell phones, because there's a lot of cell phone use here in the Philippines, really enjoyed the book reading activity. I mean, they were drawn to it, which means it really looks like a viable mode of language stimulation for them.